Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about Freedom Now within, in Freedom Now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this first Saturday of the new year, January 4th, 2025. Our central theme for today's program is prisoners and resistance. We dedicate our program today to the memory of our elder, Sheikh Baba Bilal Sunni Ali, who you are listening to now on the saxophone. He made his transition to the ancestor world, which was announced on December 30th, 2024. Here, he's playing at a Poets for Political Prisoners event. He was a Black Panther Party servant of the people, a former political prisoner himself, an ongoing warrior and soldier. He was also known by the name Spirit. And so we commence today's program with an audio clip of Baba Bilal Sunni Ali from August 2002. It's from a C-SPAN video library clip. He was at a reparations march in Washington, D.C. at the National Mall, representing the Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin Defense Fund Committee. His tireless work in advocating for reparations and freeing all political prisoners, we thank him and we continue the work as the struggle continues, and we honor him today. Then, we continue with our Freedom Now ancestral backbone, Didan Kamati, in the African drumbeat historical calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Professor Brittany Friedman, assistant professor at University of Southern California here in Los Angeles, and author of the book Carceral Apartheid, How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Professor Michael Trotti. He's a history professor at Ithaca College in upstate New York, and author of the book The End of Public Execution, Race, Religion, and Punishment in the American South. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Bilal Sunni Ali, Thelonious Monk, Neil Adler, George Benson, John Coltrane, Marquise Hill, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Free Imam Jamil. Free Imam Jamil. Free Imam Jamil. Free Mumia Abu Jamal. Free Matulu Shakur. Free Kamal Siddiqui. I mention Kamal Siddiqui because a lot of people have forgotten about Kamal Siddiqui. Kamal Siddiqui has been indicted just 3 weeks ago for a killing that took place in Atlanta 31 years ago. 31 years ago, a pig died, and 3 weeks ago, they indicted Kamal Siddiqui for it. The same judge who's presiding over his case is the same judge, Judge Mattis, who presided over Imam Jamil's case. We hope that you came today not expecting reparations today, but helping to get more informed of the work that you need to do in order to establish reparations. And we need reparations, and we call for the freedom of all our political prisoners and prisoners of war, the return of all our exiles as a part of reparations. Imam Jamil was the first case that the newly established African American Tribunal reviewed. And one of the main outcomes of the judgment and decree of the African American Tribunal is that the United States government, the United States criminal justice system, has no jurisdiction over Imam Jamil, has no jurisdiction over any of our political prisoners, has no jurisdiction of us. Understanding and treaties on international law, we wanted to tell you that under international law, and you can read more about it, that we, as established legally and politically, the more we exercise our rights, the more we go for our own court, the more we use our own court, the more it'll be established. Just like we never beg nobody could we celebrate Kwanzaa, we don't have to beg nobody can we establish our own courts. Free Mumi Abu Jamal, free Imam Jamil, free all political prisoners and prisoners of war. Assalamu alaikum.
Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research. And when you see that you got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who had problems similar to yours. And once you see how they got theirs straight, then you know how you can get yours straight.
This is Brother Didan with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of January 6th. We provide this historical calendar to further enlighten the listening audience on authentic contributions of people of color and the working class to the objective of a classless society rooted in peace, egalitarianism, and self-determination. We urge you to join an organization that's struggling for righteous social change. January 6, 1931, the Scottsboro Boys trial occurs, where 9 African youth were accused of raping 2 European women. Immortalized by the blues singer Leadbelly, NBC's TV movies, books such as To Kill a Mockingbird and Allen Ginsberg, this case drew national attention led by the peoples of Harlem, many of whom were first-generation migrants from the South, and later the Communist Party. This case was the first time that black men accused of rape in Alabama were not executed. January 7, 1891, Zora Neale Hurston was born. She got out of a jaywalking ticket once by saying, "I saw white folks crossing on the green light, so I just assumed the red was for me." She was a leading African folklorist, novelist, and the first black woman anthropologist in the United States, who recorded African folk traditions and cultures of the diaspora, especially in the United States and in Haiti. Her most notable novel, The Eyes Were Watching God, which contained active female protagonists and used black English as the language of her tales. January 8, 1886, Noble Drew Ali was born. Noble Drew Ali founded the Moorish Science Temples of North America, a continuation of the Islamic traditions in the United States. These Islamic traditions began with the importation of African prisoners of war from Islamic countries of West Africa who had superior agricultural skills for the plantation economy of slavery. Noble Drew Ali's movement gave rise to continued Islamic currents with Master Fard Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, the largest black nationalist theocratic organization in the United States today. January 8, 1959, the victory of the Socialist Cuban Revolution occurs, smashing the United States and mafia-backed Baptista regime and destroying Cuba being used as an island of sex, drugs, and gambling vices for U.S. tourists. January 9, 1905, the Russian Revolution breaks out in St. Petersburg, where the historical forces of the workers and revolutionary intelligentsia unite to overthrow the Tsarist feudal regime and build the first socialist state in modern times. Here the working class and peasants, 99% of the population becomes the rulers, not the capitalist class. The USSR within 20 years moved from being one of the poorest nations in Europe to a world power, providing unabated support for the anti-colonial liberation movements of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. January 9th, 1912, the African National Congress, the ANC of South Africa, was formed. The ANC is the oldest liberation movement in Africa. 97 years later, the ANC demonstrates that the power of the people is greater than the combination of white settler rule and Western European and U.S. combined support to maintain apartheid. The ANC is the ruling party of South Africa today. The ANC was defined by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, with the U.S. CIA orchestrating the capture and imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. January 9th, 1922, Sékou Touré, the Prime Minister of Guinea, who led this former French West African country to independence, was born. The Democratic Party of Guinea, of which Brother Touré was a leader, was the only French-speaking African country to sever all ties to the former colonial master, thereby ensuing French rage. Months before independence, the French military stripped their former colony of electrical, plumbing, dug up the roads, buildings, and all administration, attempting to destroy the infrastructure of Guinea. This was set as an example to all French colonies of the price you pay when you seek total independence as opposed to a Commonwealth status with the French. This rape of this country strengthened and fortified the Guinean people, and Sékou Touré is part of their leadership together with Ghana, the Congo, Mali, Tanzania, Algeria. The list is long of those revolutionary Pan-African countries who during the 60s fought against U.S. and European imperialism and fought for building an all-African Union government, which objectively incorporating 53 African countries into one United States of Africa, thereby providing a massive bulwark against the oppressions of any Africans worldwide and U.S. imperialism. January 10, 1894, the African kinship group known as the Tuareg rise up in armed struggle against the Portuguese in the country of Bissau, which sets the historical antecedent for the rise of Amilcar Cabral and the PAIGC. The Tuareg are a desert Muslim people who have consistently fought in Mali, Niger, Algeria against French colonialism. The Tuareg are an example of the synchronization of Islam and traditional African values and culture. For instance, women in a Tuareg society have a strong and free position, and she decides over her own life. Men, not women, wear veils over their face in public. Women play a dominant role in their society where there is a matrilineal descent pattern. January 10, 1860, Henrietta Vinton Davis was born. She was an actress, teacher, and a Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League leader. UNIA and ACL was the largest mass organization of African people in any country and any historical period in humankind history. She founded the Black Theater Company and was the director of the Black Star Shipping Line, a remarkable achievement in the era of segregation. January 10, 1864, George Washington Carver was born. Brother Carver, under a segregated U.S., was a scientist, botanist, inventor, and educator who revolutionized agriculture in the U.S. by his promotion of alternative crops to cotton, including the peanut and sweet potato, thereby increasing the quality of the soil through rotation. He invented over 100 products to be used from peanuts, including cosmetics, dyes, paints, plastic, gasoline, and nitroglycerin. His work destroyed the widespread stereotype that blacks were intellectually inferior to whites. January 11, 1959, the contemporary movement for the independence of Puerto Rico was launched as Puerto Ricans grow weary of the colonized status within the U.S. empire. January 11, 1965, poet Lorraine Hansberry, author and dramatist, dies. Her works include Raising in the Sun and To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. Her themes include anti-racism, women's rights, and African liberation from colonialism. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at Freedom Now, 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. Please join us in a unity chant of Amandala Awetu, which means the power belongs to the people. And as always, we say, Amandala Awaitu. Amandala Awaitu. Amandala Awaitu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Brittany Friedman, assistant professor at the University of Southern California and author of the book Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Professor Friedman.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, Gerald. I am super excited to talk about this. And even though it's a heavy topic, I'm always excited to talk about the illusions that run our society and how that plays into my book.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
So I wrote this book because it was very clear to me when I was a student back in 2012, 2013, I started reading about California prisons. I also knew some because I have relatives in California, and I do have relatives that were active in the Panthers. And so I wanted to learn more about California prisons. And as I was reading, it was very clear that there were a lot of lies being pushed about the Black guerrilla family, about how prisons are run here in our state. And I set out to debunk them. And that was my mission over a decade ago. And that's what led me to this book.
So you mentioned the Black guerrilla family. What was the Black guerrilla family?
The Black guerrilla family was founded officially in 1970 as the prison arm of the Black Power movement. But the origin story of the organization, at least in the public eye, is often thought of as, George Jackson is the founder, and the organization then became this powerful group in California prisons. But as I show in my book, Carceral Apartheid, the Black guerrilla family was a part of a decades-long struggle against white supremacist alliances in California prisons between officers and between Nazis that ended up forming the Aryan Brotherhood. And the Black guerrilla family could really be thought of as more of a building and a mix of Black militant groups that decided that they would be stronger together than separate. And George Jackson was a co-founder, but he wasn't the only founder. And so he was a co-founder and really helped in terms of pushing the political ideology, especially from his training from W.L. Nolan and others, and uniting people behind this notion of a prisoner class.
You mentioned George Jackson. Give us a snapshot of him.
So George Jackson was really a political genius. He was a prolific writer, as many may or may not have read his works, such as Blood in My Eye. He was a forefront in terms of thinking about how the class struggle in society had made its way into the prison system and was really being propagated intentionally by the Department of Corrections as a means of division, and how racism also functioned to twist what would otherwise be class solidarity between incarcerated people across all racial groups who would have united themselves if it wasn't for the lie that is white supremacy and the lie that one group is better than another. And that created such an amount of division, not only in society, but within the prison. And George was very much on the forefront of pointing this out. And that is what made him a threat to the Department of Corrections, to the United States government, much like many other political thinkers that we saw that were pushing against apartheid around the world at the very same time, saw the lie that is white supremacy. And George Jackson was that for the state of California.
You also mentioned in your previous comment the Aryan Brotherhood. Who was the Aryan Brotherhood? What was their ideology? How did they get started?
The Aryan Brotherhood has a very interesting backstory. And so they start out as a group of bikers. Many of them served in the war, and so they were veterans. And Some had pre-existing, very explicit Nazi ideology, but others were simply a part of biker groups and became incarcerated. And so what happens is during this time in California prisons, you start to see a steady increase in the incarceration of Black people. And in particular, as the civil rights movement is raging on in society, there becomes this huge fear amongst incarcerated white people and officers that the riots and that the organizing and the boycotting that they were seeing in society was going to start happening in prisons to push back against their racist system. And so the Aryan Brotherhood forms as this group of incarcerated white people in San Quentin in the 60s that unites themselves, that is made up of these different backgrounds and these different groups. And they take on this Aryan ideology, heavily influenced by the Nazi co-founders, and they begin waging war against incarcerated Black people, but especially targeting those that were doing the work of organizing fellow Black people. And so people like W.L. Nolan, people like George Jackson, they became quickly at the top of the hit list for the Aryan Brotherhood and the white officers that were backing them, especially in San Quentin.
And you also mentioned in your pages the Mexican Mafia. What was the Mexican Mafia?
So what's very interesting about the Mexican Mafia is that even though today, and as I show in my book, really in the 80s starting, they begin this alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood against the Black guerrilla family. But what's interesting though is about the Mexican Mafia's origin story is similar in some ways to the Black guerrilla family. And what I mean by that is that they were founded by a group of Chicano incarcerated people that were being victimized and brutalized by white officers. Because, as we know here in California, the history of hatred against Chicano people is very high, right? Even though California used to be Mexico before it was stolen. So, this set of men, they organized themselves as self-defense against white supremacist officers. And that's what's very interesting, is because once they organize themselves, they then, face the criminalization of the Department of Corrections, being called a gang, similar to what happened with the Black guerrilla family. But they also start evolving, and tensions start rising between the Mexican Mafia and the Black militants. And I use that term in terms of that's how what they called themselves. Tensions started to arise between them and the Mexican Mafia, but a lot of it was orchestrated. And what I mean by that is that officers were creating and setting up situations to cause racial infighting, because it would be incredibly dangerous for them if all people of color united themselves against the Aryan Brotherhood and the Department of Corrections.
So you referred a few times to the prisoners' guards, who have a union as well. Talk to us about that particular union and also their role in terms of political donations.
The California Peace Officers Union, as they call themselves, even though they are very far from promoting peace, they are one of the most powerful unions in our country. They have substantial donors, substantial backers, and they were very influential in lobbying for many of the very harsh punishments that we witnessed in California, especially during the war on crime and the war on drugs. They were behind backing, for example, 3 strikes. They're very much an antagonistic force for the rights of incarcerated people. They protect their own. And so, we talk about in society the thin blue line when talking about police officers, but we should also be talking about that when we are referring to correctional officers, because they protect themselves also through their image. So even the name California Peace Officers Union is a lie. It is an illusion to give you the idea that that is a part of their mission, when in reality, their union, their officers have been at the forefront of promoting racial warfare within California prisons for over 50 years.
And what role does Pelican Bay play in your book, Professor Friedman?
Pelican Bay plays a large role in my book in the later chapters. And so in Carceral Apartheid, I show how Pelican Bay becomes this solution in the minds of prison officials in Sacramento for what they have deemed as their decades-long Black militant problem. And so in the dark corners of adjustment centers throughout prisons in California, beginning in the 1950s, Black militants were segregated and held and tortured, and in this idea of being readjusted, literally. It's a eugenicist policy and ideation around changing one's political beliefs, but also one's humanity, and trying to destroy it. And so the adjustment center, which George Jackson also writes about, is a huge tool of oppression. And I talk about the adjustment center in chapter 2 of my book. But in the later chapters, I show how the adjustment center becomes the model for what Pelican Bay is, which is the Supermax prison here in California. It houses people who are allegedly verified often through illegal means, through also forcing people to turn informant in ways that are questionable. And if you look at the legislative record, George Jackson, his legacy, the Black guerrilla family, becomes a big part of the oration and the arguments put forth by lawmakers as to why we need this huge Supermax dungeon in our state, where people can't come out of their cell except for 1 hour a day, if they're allowed. So it's a horrendous sight, and it is very important to the history of not just the Black guerrilla family, but the history of social control in the United States.
Now, is it fair to suggest that Pelican Bay prison is in the process of being downsized?
So it is fair to suggest that, but something that I find interesting is that there have been several lawsuits and very public hunger strikes by incarcerated people to protest what is Pelican Bay, right? To protest this, 23 hours a day in a cell, and what is torture. And what's interesting about these protests is that they were organized by people across racial and political organizations that united finally, right? So George Jackson's mission is realized, the co-founders of the Black guerrilla family's missions realized, where they're now uniting, right, in the 2010s and even now around this notion of a prisoner class to fight back. And so I encourage your listeners to, if they have not already seen it, to look up the agreement to end hostilities, which is very important in showcasing what happens when people unite, what happens when people wake up to the lie that is white supremacy, right? Because you even have people who once held allegiances to the Aryan Brotherhood who signed on to that agreement. And so it's very powerful to see the names next to it. And the Department of Corrections has intentionally and deliberately worked against it at every step. Even when they were ordered to abide by certain rulings, given that lawsuit that they needed to scale back in terms of solitary and segregation. The Department of Corrections has fought it at every step, and they continue to fight it. They continue to lock people up in solitary to validate people as being members of organizations using just, pretty much nothing. It could take having a letter from the wrong person in your cell to be validated and sent to Pelican Bay and be tortured for the rest of your life. So it's hard for me to say that it's actually being scaled back. I think in reality that it's not.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Brittany Friedman, author of the book Carceral Apartheid, you teach at the University of Southern California. Would you advise younger members of our audience to matriculate there as an undergraduate or a graduate student?
I would. And I say that because, USC has gone through a lot of radical changes in the last 5-10 years. We have a lot of really amazing faculty that are working, not just, in the ivory tower, but that are actively working with communities. Myself, I have a research lab where we actively work with organizations. We work with prisoners' rights advocates, and we do things like submit depositions. We submit written testimony based on our research. And we have a lot of research assistants that are undergraduate and graduate students to get them involved in this work. And a lot of my colleagues do the same in sociology, where I'm at, but also in other departments. So, faculty that I really respect, like Jody Armour in the law school, has really been, a pillar of this work at USC for many years. And he was a big reason why I wanted to come to USC as a faculty member. And there's many like him and others across the university. And so I would say that now is the perfect time to come and study and learn and do radical work at USC.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Friedman, author of the book Carceral Apartheid, How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
James Earl Carter, 1924-2024. His name, James Earl Carter Jr., was not a famous one, for few knew him by that name. But millions knew him by his nickname, his high-voltage smile, and his Georgia accent as Jimmy Carter, American president. Of all the modern presidents, he was perhaps the smartest, as he dabbled in nuclear physics and found his footing in politics after the scandal of Watergate as a political outsider. But in political terms, because he lost re-election, he was treated as a political leper. Carter, known as an avatar of human rights, lived a remarkable post-presidency, as much as did his wife, Rosalind, who served the poor by building thousands of houses, treated chronic diseases in Africa, and monitored elections worldwide. His recent death, after 100 years of life, marked a truly remarkable life. His 1980 election loss to former actor Ronald Reagan also marked a turning point in American politics. Why? Carter lost in part because the Iranians took American hostages and held them until Reagan took office. Some political observers say high inflation was also a factor, but that wasn't the real reason. Carter lost principally because when he first ran for the presidency, he won some 75% of the white evangelical vote. When he ran for re-election, that number had fallen to around 25%, which meant a fall of some 50 points. No politician can survive such a plunge. Carter announced and aired his support for civil rights. White evangelicals fled in terror. Why? Because for them, Christianity meant whiteness, and segregation was in furtherance of whiteness. Think of recent evangelical support for Trump. Evangelicals equals whiteness. It did then, it does now. Seen in this light, black liberation amounts to anathema. A little lesson from history. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Michael Trotti, Professor of History at Ithaca College in upstate New York, and author of the book, The End of Public Execution, Race, Religion, and Punishment in the American South. Thank you for joining us on KPFK Los Angeles, Michael Trotti.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate having this conversation.
Ditto. So why did you write this book?
My first book was on sensational murder cases in the South. It was really a study of the press and sensationalism. But so many of those stories ended at the gallows. And so with that first book, I sort of dipped my toe into the scholarship of how executions were operating in the U.S. South. And I found that weirdly, even though the South was the area of the United States that was executing the most, there was very little scholarship on executions in the South. For my second book project, for this one, I focused there. So that's what led me into it. I have to say, though, that what created this book was the process. That is to say, I started with the assumptions that the wider field had, that these public executions were very much like lynchings. And what I found when I got into the materials and looked closer at what ended up being more than 1,300 executions that I studied in this book, I found that they were in fact very different from the narratives of that we know of from the history of lynching. So that pulled me in quite a different direction and made it quite a different book than I originally thought that it was going to be.
Now, you mentioned a black man in the 1880s by the name of John Williams, who was about to be executed. And his, quote, performance, unquote, as he's about to meet his maker, so to speak, illustrates a wider theme of your book. Could you talk about that?
John Williams and any number of other African Americans who were arraigned and convicted by white juries in front of white judges, and then condemned to legal execution. So this is going through the process the way the law says you're supposed to go through the process, but are being condemned. He met his fate, as so many did, by really in interesting ways upending the nature of these moments. So the state, the sort of white state of the South, would like for these moments to be teaching the underclass, teaching the wider population that this is what happens to you when you get out of line, that this is what happens to you when you are condemned, when you are convicted of crimes, and to have it be a chastening moment. But instead, so many of these African-American condemned have African-American ministers with them on the gallows, and their confession may be a confession, some did, some didn't, of the crime, that they were in fact guilty of the crime that they were condemned. Sometimes they said they were innocent, sometimes they said they were guilty. If they said they were guilty, they would say things like, "And stay away from liquor, it led me astray," and so forth. But what the minister on the scaffold and what the condemned went on to do was to have something like a camp meeting, a religious service at the gallows, in which that confession, whether it was confessing the crime or confessing more generally, I am a sinner, and I deserve to go to hell, and it's only the grace of God that will save me in the next life. They turned these into moments of contrition, moments of sanctification. Ministers sang hymns, not condemnatory hymns, but ones about how all of us, all of humanity, are sinners. The message that comes out of these is nothing like the message the state would like for these events to be. They were, in fact, more or less a celebration of coming back to the Lord, a sinner who has come back and proclaimed his devotion to Christ and is asking for the congregation, sometimes they actually use that word, at the gallows to sing these hymns and to help him reach glory. "I'll see you all in glory," so many of them said. So this is sort of the center of what this book is, and what I found in this research was that this is nothing like a lynching. This is a subversion, really, of the goals of the whites. I would call it a totalitarian state in terms of African Americans in the South. It's a subversive moment in which African Americans are proclaiming their not just humanity, but their Christian bona fides. So it's a really different sort of a thing than what the scholarship previously had imagined them to be, just likening them to something like lynchings.
And I take it that the state was so upset by these, quote, performances, unquote, at the point of execution, that they converted public executions where an audience would assemble to private executions behind walls. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, although as I trace in a couple of chapters, it was a very tortured kind of process, and there are good reasons for that. One is it was just the way that you did things. It was a part of the tradition of not just the South, but the nation. I mean, all executions until you get to the 1820s and 30s in the United States were public executions. Seeing the penalties in public was just what the law was. You start in the North and then in the West to have this movement to get rid of public executions in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And the scholarship on that has generally said it was a sort of middle class. These have gotten to be disgusting events, focused on something so gross, and the crowds assembled, there might be more crimes committed by people drinking and whatever. That's the kind of story that was told, and the one that I expected to find when I looked into the history of the South. What I found instead was that this tradition was really tightly held by both whites and blacks. And so you had, in the South, and so you had white sheriffs, when greeted with laws that were written with any kind of wiggle room. At first, the laws that were passed to make them private said something like behind walls if available or unless the judge proclaim otherwise, or something like that. Lots of wiggle room. In those moments when sheriffs and judges were given that discretion, they were often choosing to have public executions. And so there were a lot of whites in the South who persisted in thinking this is a positive thing to demonstrate the power of the state and so forth. But the sort of central change that made the white South in the late 19th century increasingly decide, and it's sort of state by state, legislature by legislature, having votes and making this call, to make this change away from public execution, was the fact that the minister who is on the stage would have been a white man in the antebellum period. And the minister who was on this stage in front of whites and blacks, thousands of people, one of the largest groups of people gathered in this era, would have been at these executions. After the Civil War, it would have been an African-American minister. And so the nature of the event shifts in the racial vision of white people in the South, so that this is granting an awful lot of authority to white ministers and to white condemned in an era in which everything else in the South is being very firmly segregated. And so this is an exceptional moment in which you have whites and blacks looking at a stage, in essence. That's what a scaffold sort of appears like when it's in front of a massive crowd. And the actors on the stage, the sheriff's there, and he pulls the cord to make the trap fall and so forth. But on that stage is a black minister, or two or three or four, and a black condemned, and there are African Americans in the crowd singing hymns along with the condemned. And so this is absolutely going against the grain of what whites in the South wanted these moments of punishment to be. And in that way, you're exactly right, that the legislature starts saying, this is simply valorizing, it's making into heroes, making into people that others might want to emulate, these people who are supposed to be condemned, saying we'll see you all in heaven, as if the gallows is a shortcut to heaven, is the way some people in the legislature, some editors in newspapers and some legislatures started talking about it.
Now, speaking of that latter point, you suggest that 85% of legal executions in the South post-U.S. Civil War were Black. What inferences do you draw from that fact, and how is it threaded, if at all, through your story?
So the 85% is almost the same as the percentage of those that we know of who were lynched in the South who are African American. I think the number, from the best numbers that we have so far, lynchings are so much harder to find because a lot of them were surreptitious and nobody was keeping track in the same way, and it's hard to differentiate murders from lynchings in any capacity. So they're more tricky, but 87% is the figure that's the best one that we have right now for the percentage of those who are lynched in the South, illegally killed by groups of people. So these were just hideous events, and 13% of those were of white people, and they would have been lower class whites who had especially performed sexual crimes that the populace was particularly incensed about. That sort of thing was the trend there in those numbers. And I find the similar sort of a thing in the white population, the much smaller numbers of whites who were legally executed in this period. They were almost all lower class whites who were, as marginal as white people could be in the South, were the people who were getting condemned in this period. In this era, the population of the South was something like 30% African American. And so this means 2.5 times more African Americans were being executed than whites in terms of their proportion of the population. And it makes it almost, you can almost talk about it as being, this is a punishment that is for African Americans in the South. I would say in this book, what I make of it is that this is part and parcel of the racist regime that was erected in the post-war South, although I have to say the numbers are somewhat similar during the era of slavery as well. Vast majority of those who were executed in the South were African Americans then too. One thing that I would say is in the entire United States, not just the South, the only states that got rid of capital punishment in the 19th century were ones that had minuscule numbers of minorities of any sort. And those would have been places like, oh, am I going to get the name wrong? Wisconsin, I think Vermont, and now I've forgotten the other two. And I hope I've got those first two right. So these were places that just, there weren't African Americans, and they felt like they could get rid of capital punishment. That opens up for me huge questions in terms of the nation and in terms of capital punishment and its longer term history. And, as you surely know, those on death row are vastly disproportionate in terms of being minority populations today as well. So in the South, this is just a piece of a much larger regime of racial repression in the late 19th century that is erected in the wake of the tremendously powerful racist regime of slavery. So an invading army at the point of a gun with constitutional changes, you had to end the entire system of punishments that slavery was, and upend the entire political, social system of the South. It was a very wrenching change. In the wake of that, the South erects something serviceable that performs many of the same functions differently, but many of the same functions as their thoroughgoing punishment regime during slavery. And capital punishment is one piece of that. Convict labor is another piece of that. Erecting new laws for getting people into the convict labor system was another piece of that. Having white juries, they already had white lawmakers, white judges, white lawyers. Having white juries after 1880, that's going to be a piece of that. The police are going to be white in the South, that's a piece of it. This is one part of a much larger set of established systems to keep African Americans in their place.
So 85% of legal executions in the South were Black. I take it that disproportionately these were Black men, but yes. I assume that some were Black women. A twofold
Believe it or not,
question.
I know exactly how many.
Oh.
It's so few, I know that there are 20 African American women who were executed. There were 2 white women who were executed, 20 African American women, and all of the other 3,000 were men, and almost all of those were Black men. So I'm sorry, I sort of interrupted you. Did you want to put a finer point on the question of gender?
Well, my question would be whether Black and white women who were being executed, did they, quote, perform, unquote, like black men tended to do at the gallows with ministers and confessions, perhaps, etc.
Yes, there is almost no difference. And frankly, among the white condemned, there was not a whole lot of difference as well. And so that's how this is a very interestingly complicated issue. It was so much a part of the tradition that lower class whites, who would be the ones who would be going to the gallows, were likely going to be evangelical Christians as well, and similarly have confessions and so forth. The newspapers dealt with it very differently, I have to say, but otherwise there are a lot of parallels. Whites tended to betray the norms that I just laid out earlier in this conversation about confession and all of that, more than African Americans did. They might be more likely to be angry and just venting on the gallows or silent on the gallows than the African American condemned. But between black women and black men, there is no difference in the role that religion plays and the role that the newspapers reporting them say about the nature of these events. One thing that is different is that there is more compassion for African American condemned and more questions raised about, even certainly with white women, that was true, but with African American women, it was also somewhat true. More questions raised in terms of whether this is the appropriate punishment for a woman. Because often the crime that they were convicted of was not murder themselves, but was, helping their boyfriend to murder their husband, or something like this, where they are accused of being a part of a criminal conspiracy. Is it the right thing to execute a woman for that? And I think that gets at why there were so few. So that even when a crime was committed by a woman, black or white, there would be much more of a close look at, well, is there some other punishment that might be appropriate for them? Whereas with African American men, I did not find that sentiment.
A lack of compassion, comparatively speaking, for black men is your conclusion.
Absolutely. And it is much more likely that there will be vicious things that are said, depending upon the crime. Of course, every one of these events is its own individual experience, and there's quite a bit of variety. But in general, there is not just a lack of compassion. It's almost like I would not say it's like they're looking for something to deem evil or bestial, but they are certainly framing the condemned as someone who is worthy of getting rid of them, of this punishment of death.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Michael Trotti, professor of history at Ithaca College in upstate New York, author of the book, The End of Public Execution, Race, Religion, and Punishment in the American South. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests. Thank you, Dr. Brittany Friedman. Thank you, Dr. Michael Trotti. Thank you to our co-producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board up Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our Sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa, and signing off for Freedom Now. This is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.